good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for joining our MSDI Research Seminar Series. My name's Cameron Allen. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at MSDI, based in the research team. I'd like to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose lands Monash campuses are located in Melbourne, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara peoples on whose land I'm located here in Brisbane, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So as you know, the MSDI Research Seminar Series aims to foster interdisciplinary conversations on the grand sustainable development challenges of our time. And for today's session, I have the pleasure of introducing Associate Professor Thomas Hickmann, who's joining us from Lund University in Sweden. So Thomas is based in the Department of Political Science at Lund, and his research focuses on global governance of transboundary sustainability challenges, and he has a particular interest in how societies can adequately deal with global common goods and institutions needed to overcome collective action problems. And related to this, Thomas has written extensively on governance and the Sustainable Development Goals, and has made some important contributions to SDGs research, which is influential in the global discourse on the SDGs. For example, Thomas was an editor and lead author of a global assessment of scientific evidence on the political impact of the SDGs, which drew on over 3,000 scientific studies and involved over 60 different experts, including MSDI researchers. And key findings from that assessment were also published in Nature Sustainability in 2022. And today, Thomas will be sharing with us some of his key insights that he's gleaned from his research on the SDGs, which has been quite extensive in recent years. So we are recording the session today. There will be plenty of time for questions at the end of the session. So feel free to either pop them in the chat or raise your hand after the presentation. So I'll hand it over to you, Thomas. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for this very kind introduction and for the invitation also to this seminar series. It's a pleasure to be here and give my input. And when I prepared my session or my input for the session today, I realized that I've spoken to quite diverse audiences about the SDGs. I was at a panel of the EcoSoc Partnership Forum last year, and then also had a keynote at an event of the so-called Volk-Universität here in Lund, which is an adult association for education, and also provided a guest talk at my son's international school in Lund for children from 8 to 13. And I gave many presentations at academic conferences. And whenever I talked about the SDGs, I had to find a balance between being critical on the one hand and being positive on the other hand, or maybe too pessimistic or too optimistic about the SDGs. And overall, it seems that I'm most critical when I speak to scholars. And let's see whether this is also the case today in my input. So I prepared about 35 minutes of an input, and then I'm very much looking forward to discussions or questions from your side. That would be great. Yeah, the title of my input is Governance and Accountability Challenges of SDG Implementation. And I thought it makes sense to structure my input into 3 parts. So first, I would like to look back at past efforts to implement the SDGs. Not fully successful, as you all know, but still, in my view, important to take stock. And then I would like to highlight governance and accountability challenges in the 2030 agenda. And finally, rather briefly, I would then also like to point to governance reforms to accelerate the global endeavor to attain the SDGs. And I think many of your scholars at the Institute have also been involved in this endeavor. I know that. And also when I reread the 2030 agenda, I find the wording and vision of the text to transform our world towards a more just and peaceful future quite ambitious, extremely ambitious actually. And the 2030 agenda with the 17 SDGs is certainly not perfect, And in the end, we all know that it's a political compromise and a product of these tedious political negotiations prior to the adoption of the SDGs in 2015. And today, I assume the adoption of the SDGs would not be possible anymore, given current global power constellations. So the question is, what we make out of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. Sounds a bit of like a conclusion already, but that's more my idea to share my general impression of the SDGs in the beginning. Yeah, let me start with the stock taking in the beginning. And here I wanted to mention first these two key reports that you hopefully can see on the slides from last year that measured the overall progress of the SDGs and came to disappointing results. So the independent group of scientists then last year published this report stating that the world is not on track to achieve the goals by 2030, and we are more off track than 4 years ago because of many events that happened in the meantime, of course, but also because of other governance challenges that I will highlight later on. And secondly, we also have this report from the United Nations Office, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals report. The new one will be published next week. I just learned yesterday. And here the report from last year said that we have entered an age of holy crisis and need a full-fledged rescue plan for people and planet. So that's quite an alarm signal that has been sent out last year by the United Nations. And this is also very much in line with our findings from the SDG impact assessment that some of you also were involved from Monash Institute, which is the first research project that I would like to highlight in my input. And there are a couple of more projects, also future projects that I would like to mention in my talk. So it's a bit of a tour d'horizon tour through a couple of research projects that I'm involved in. And this SDG impact assessment that was published in 2022, 2 years ago, together with Frank Biermann and Carol Ann Sennett, and many other colleagues, 60 in total. I will talk about this also later on briefly. Here we did not measure progress of the SDGs, to what extent they can be achieved by 2030 or not. But instead, we evaluated the existing knowledge in the scientific community about the political impact of the SDGs, very much focusing on governance factors. And our guiding research question with this assessment was whether, to what extent and how have the SDGs exerted and any substantial political steering effects, we call it, on actors and institutions at different levels of governance. And very briefly here, the background: 61 authors have been involved, both senior and early career researchers, and from all over the world. And it was as you also said in the beginning already, a broad assessment of 3,000 articles that we retrieved from Scopus, and 10 to 20% we looked closer into in different groups, we can say. So it was again, these 60 authors working in different teams. And we analyzed particularly 3 effects, or looked at whether there are these 3 effects. First, discursive effects. Here we asked and assessed the literature with regard to the question whether there are any changes in how actor frames or actor framing or debate sustainable development. Is there any clear effect on our language? Is there any effect on the overall discourse, but also the debates about sustainable development in general through the SDGs? Secondly, we looked at so-called institutional effects. And the question here was, broadly speaking, do we observe new administrative arrangements, new bodies or units or new cultures even in existing public administrations dealing with the SDGs? And lastly, we also looked at normative effects, and this was most wide-ranging. The question here was, are there any changes in legislation, rules, policies, and programs at different levels of governance and even in different sectors, private sector, also the NGO sector? That was our starting point. And we also looked at different governance dimensions, we called it here, in different chapters. So global governance was one important focus. Then there was one on implementation at multiple levels. Rob Raven was one of the lead authors for this particular chapter. Institutional integration and coherence was another focus of our assessment. Inclusiveness at global and local scales we also looked at, and then finally planetary integrity. All important governance dimensions we wanted to assess in our study. And jumping to the core findings already, because you might also have come across these findings already. So just to summarize, we recognize that the SDG assessment found that the political impact of the SDGs has so far mainly been discursive. So it has indeed changed our debate, how we understand, how we perceive sustainable development. And this we can observe in different sectors and also at different levels of governance. So for instance, also the input I gave at the school, international school of my son, they also had a program on the SDGs for younger kids. And they also have posters everywhere. And here in Sweden, you see that quite often, that public institutions work with the SDGs, that talk about them. And it's quite in the discussion, in the debate. That's quite positive, of course. But on the other hand, we see that profound institutional and normative effects remain rather scarce, very limited. So we see some new institutions established for the SDGs, but they normally reproduce existing political trajectories. And we also see some new initiatives, new political programs for achieving the SDGs in national ministries, also at local level. You have been quite focusing on the local level, I think, at Monash Institute, and it's good to see some initiatives also on the ground, but there's not much of an overall trend among, we argued, we found from the literature leading towards sustainable development, even though there are some signals turning towards the good direction. Again, I have to find the balance between being too pessimistic or too optimistic. So, but then our overall conclusion was the SDGs are not yet leading to transformational change, and the voluntary nature of the 2030 agenda makes it easy for actors to implement the goals in a way that benefits their self-interests. So we talked about this in the beginning, Cameron, that it's obviously so broad that every actor can make it functional for his or her own interests. And that's, of course, a downside I will also touch upon a bit later. And then more recently, we published a follow-up study, which we called a scoping article. And again, cannot click here on show all authors, but also some of Monash University are part of this big author team of 30 plus authors. And when we presented the results of the SDG impact assessment, mainly last year, our key message was often that it's possible to see the glass is half full or half empty. And despite the overall disappointing results of the SDG impact assessment, it still indicated that the SDGs in some instances led to new institutions, new norms and policies, however, with much variation across countries, sectors, and levels. And against this background, we wanted to continue delving deeper into some of these governance areas where we observed some, at least initial change due to the SDGs. And we explored this in a follow-up study where we studied in particular how political changes take place due to the SDGs. And we analyzed under what conditions these developments bolster sustainability transformations. And that was published earlier this year. And briefly about the key idea we had in this scoping article. So, of course, we wanted to build upon the SDG impact assessment, and we conducted then an expert survey directed at all the fellows of the Earth System Governance Network that perhaps many of you know, comprising about 500 to 600 scholars, if I'm not mistaken. And we received quite a good turnaround, and we discussed then the results from the survey at a virtual workshop, also with some invited experts. And in this project, in this process, we identified 5 governance areas where we indeed have some initial political changes due to the SDGs. And these 5 focus areas have then grown into working groups that we organized into or within the SDG task force of the Earth System Governance Project. And we wanted to continue the discussion of the SDG assessment and try to find how and under what conditions we see this limited but still existing impact of the SDGs. And these governance areas were, again, global governance for the SDGs, because we here with the high-level political forum on sustainable development, we saw some good signals that the SDGs are leading to a bit of a review, good debate, and even some incentives for national governments to increase their efforts to achieve the SDGs. We also looked at national policy integration of the SDGs, because we all know that there are some more progressive countries in the world that try to use the SDGs in their political programs more than others. We also looked at subnational initiatives for SDG implementation, because we see here pioneering cities, pioneering subnational authorities that use the SDG much more ambitiously than their national counterparts. We also looked at private governance for the SDGs. Again, here there are laggards, but also some front runners in the private sector. And finally, we also looked at education and learning for sustainable development, simply because this was highlighted very much in the survey as the way to go to enhance and accelerate the SDGs and political programs to achieve sustainable development in different jurisdictions. So that was the key approach and also key idea of the whole endeavor. And the focus then was that we, bit of repetition here, but the focus was that we delve deeper into these 5 selected governance areas, and we aim to contribute to the current debate about opportunities for accelerating SDG implementation by asking this particular question: where and how is incremental change taking place due to the SDGs, and under what conditions can these areas be seen as engines of change for a larger transformation? So the intention was always to see possibilities for diffusion, for upscaling, for broadening these initial initiatives, sometimes on the ground, sometimes at the global level, and sometimes also at the national level. Jumping to the results, we state that when we looked at 5 governance areas with these initial changes due to the SDGs, that it's quite patchy and often, unfortunately, again, pessimistic or disappointing, also symbolic uptake of the SDGs. It's not a general statement. So we indeed also in this larger endeavor, we saw that some actors take it seriously. They indeed use the SDGs, sometimes at the local level, especially together with civil society organizations, also saw it as a chance for attracting perhaps funds from higher levels of governance, but also as a chance to restructure their initiatives and to indeed make their local areas, the urban areas, more sustainable. And the SDGs here are a tool for local governments to achieve sustainable development on the ground. And while some studies have pointed to pioneering, that's I would say a pioneering SDG implementation initiative, and it's not only in the local area, also in the private sector to some extent, and also at the national level, and but hesitant to say also at the global level. And also there's a bit of more meaningful collaboration, what I just mentioned about the collaboration between civil society, local governments, and even private locally organized private companies. Nevertheless, there's, in our conclusion, no clear pathway towards sustainable development. It's again still fragmented, it's rather localized, and there's not much of a strong move overall towards sustainable development. And then we asked the big question, taking stock of the concept of governance through goals, whether this mode of governance is effective at all, or whether we have to admit that this governance mode is not really effective. Already again, a bit of a concluding remark here, even though I still have to go through two other parts that are a bit shorter, but whether we have to change direction and still whether it makes sense to believe that these voluntary goals can, in the end, tackle this huge challenge of achieving sustainable development at a larger scale. I will come back to this bigger discussion whether governance through goals makes sense, put in simple terms. But before that, I wanted to come to my second part, and here it's again briefer, but I wanted to highlight governance and accountability challenges in the 2030 agenda, coming back to the overarching title of this input. And in this second part, I would like to maybe firstly talk about the governance challenges that are a bit of a summary of what I said earlier. In a nutshell, we observe that on the one hand, the voluntary nature of the SDGs allows governments to implement the goals in their own national interests, and also other actors simply use the SDGs sometimes as a labeling, as a stamp on their business production, as a nice colorful picture in their brochures, and that's not what leads, in my view, to large scale transformations. But that's also what we have. So we have to admit and recognize that the SDGs were not, it was not possible to make them legally binding, of course. But this voluntary character, of course, is a huge governance challenge or gap. Secondly, there's also the discrepancy between promises and realities. So it's the gap between what governments promise, they all are subscribed to the SDGs, and then their real action. And this is widening. It's also a bit similar to the climate area, where we also see with the Paris Agreement high promises, sometimes also in the NDCs, in the nationally determined contributions, but then in the end, it's quite different in the real actions on the ground. And this concerns both countries from the global north and countries from the global south. There is a widening gap between their promises and realities. And thirdly, another clear governance challenge is that political will is lacking in many countries to take the SDGs seriously and prioritize sustainable development. And this might be, of course, due to other challenges at the moment with the outbreak or the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, and also earlier the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic, and also the conflict in Israel-Palestine. So it's all, of course, turning attention to other critical issues. But on the other hand, we also know that the SDGs might be a good recipe actually to mitigate and maybe even in the future avoid such challenges and crisis situations. But that's not the case. So governments don't think like I do, and they actually have other priorities, obviously, and political will is the point I would like to make here, is lacking among many governments. So in a nutshell, these are high or big government challenges. And on the other hand, and that's quite related, I would argue, we also see strong accountability challenges. And here we could go into more detail, but due to the lack of time, I keep it short. And broadly speaking, I would argue the SDGs are not yet deeply incorporated into political structures and public debates at national and local levels. Partly they are increasingly, but on a broader scale, larger scale, it's not there yet. And this leads to limited accountability for the SDGs. The question is how to study, on the one hand, these governance challenges further. So briefly go through these open questions that, in my view, are still present in the literature. So the first question I would like to touch upon is causality. So the question that we have to ask ourselves, if we are researchers, then if we observe progress towards SDG achievement, is that actually due to the SDGs, or is it due to larger developments that even started before the SDGs? So it's quite related to the next point, path dependency. So where and when is any SDG achievement simply a continuation of earlier trends that started well before 2015? And maybe the SDGs are a bit of an engine catalyst for stronger action to some extent in some cases for sustainable development, but it's not really the causal factor for bringing actors closer to achieving sustainable development. Next point here on the list is rainbow washing. So we know greenwashing quite a lot, and now rainbow washing is also maybe a term that is more widely used. The question is, when does a reference to the SDG signal behavioral change, or is it rather simply making these brochures or the reports from also governments but also companies more colorful? Are they simply using the SDGs to brand or strengthen their own brands and their reputation, or is it really that we see behavioral change? And for that, it's not enough to read the reports, right? We have to delve deeper and continue empirical research, and I would say also to reach out to people and conducting surveys, but also talking to people what they actually really do in response to the SDGs in their administrations or in their units, in their organizations, private or public. Selectivity, we also came across in our SDG assessment and again in our scoping article. Question is, where do we observe variation in the steering effects of the SDGs? And again, maybe some actors refer to one SDG that might be very much in line with their institution, with their organization, like economic growth, which is also one part of the or sustainable growth, but still growth, and they continue to put emphasis on that while neglecting the other SDGs and neglect the holistic perspective of the SDGs, which is, I think, in my view, actually the major strength. But then they pick and choose their SDGs in order to claim that we are good in achieving the SDGs, while actually only continuing business as usual. Lastly, bidirectionality. It was especially true PhD students in Utrecht that used this term, and they found out, of course, actors have also been part of the whole creation process of the SDGs, and this might also lead to biases. So if actors implement the SDGs, this might also be because these actors have co-created these SDGs. And is that then a strong impact of the SDGs? I doubt it. It's more like that some actors have been powerful in also framing, designing the agenda, but then also, of course, it might be easy for them to be strong in the achievement of these particular SDGs. These are a bit of also future study or avenues for further research. And similar to that, I think we also see that in the accountability area. And here I'm reporting about actually a current research idea I have together with Magdalena Bexell, who is also associate professor here at the Department of Political Science in Lund. And we frame it building upon Åsa Persson and others about emerging accountability ecosystems for the SDGs, we call it here so far. It's very much in the process, early idea we have, but the argument here is that, and it's quite promising in our view, to focus on the combination of governance and accountability challenges. And the idea is that we address governance challenges, those sketched above and maybe even others, that we need to build up accountability channels, accountability tools in public administrative systems. And these channels, these tools, then should hold public authorities accountable for their promises to achieve the SDGs. So the first point here on the slide is that emerging accountability ecosystems are crucial to achieve the SDGs. And we see that some countries might be more advanced in establishing accountability ecosystems, and they even have already some good ideas how to measure, evaluate all their policies with regard to the SDGs. Germany, for instance, has introduced a traffic light system, questioning to what extent each policy is in line, or maybe not in line, with achieving the SDGs. These are small examples, and overall, we see such accountability ecosystems in domestic systems or in domestic politics still emerging. They're not fully established. And the emergence of such accountability ecosystems is not a linear process, and we have ups and downs. In Sweden, for example, we had a previous more progressive government that included, for instance, civil society organizations much more progressively, much more openly in their assessment of the SDGs and also in their endeavor to implement the SDGs, while the current government is cutting funding for civil society organizations to work on the SDGs, is also excluding civil society from decision-making processes about the SDGs, and is obviously closing the door for other actors to bring in expertise and ideas how to achieve the SDGs, simply because Sweden's current government has other priorities, not placing it on sustainable development. In that way, we argue that Sweden is quite advanced generally in the area of sustainable development, but obviously also this can change. And the emerging accountability ecosystem might also not grow further at the moment, but rather be not abolished and not destroyed totally, but it might be downgraded. It might be, pushed back. That's what we see, a bit of a backlash similar to the climate area again, also in general. And then last point here on the slide, we observed so far, and it's preliminary observation, of course, but it takes a long time to establish such accountability ecosystems in public administrative systems, while they can be destroyed quite quickly. Again, I'm not saying that they're completely destroyed in Sweden. There are many institutions that are still work with the SDGs. We have national auditing systems, and we also have civil society that continues to work with the SDGs and tries to try to push the government, but it's a bit pushed back by the current ministers and executive in office. And that's good to keep in mind, that these emerging ecosystems for accountability are, let's say, not strong enough yet. And in my view, it's quite crucial to continue to build them up in order to have a chance to achieve the 2030 agenda, and maybe even also what comes next after the 2030 agenda. We need such accountability systems for ecosystems for sustainable development in domestic systems. Then jumping to the final part of my input, which is to point to governance reforms to accelerate the global endeavor to attain the SDGs. And this is an article we published last year. And the idea was that we, against the backdrop of governance gaps and limited accountability, proposed a set of 4 governance reforms at the global level to revive the efforts to achieve the SDGs. And this was the article in Science, just a 2-page article, a policy forum. Van Bierman was the lead author, and then again a couple of co-authors. And we made 4 points, and I will quickly mention them here. So we call for first differentiation. So we argued that, of course, it's nice that the SDGs are inclusive, and to some extent they put all countries into one boat, and do not make the distinction of the MDGs between industrialized and developing countries, but instead has this strong inclusiveness. But nevertheless, we think that it's important that there's greater responsibility for high income countries. So while the 2030 agenda has this universal approach, high income countries need to go ahead and provide funding instruments for sustainable development. That's our call, first call in this short article. Secondly, we also call for stronger, or let's say, dynamization. And here we mean a mechanism to raise national political ambitions over time. Again, there's this parallel to the climate area where we have this ratcheting up mechanism, not working perfectly, but according to some experts and also our observations, it's still giving an incentives, right, for political actors to increase their ambition over time. And such a mechanism will also be needed for the SDGs, which then also should undergo regular rounds of revisions, most preferably in the HLPF, in the high-level political forum on sustainable development, where countries can enhance their policies over time, also informed by assessments from the United Nations reports, and also from the independent group of scientists and others. Thirdly, we also call for stronger legalization. And of course, we don't think it's feasible to turn the SDGs into a legally binding document. But we actually argue that we need complementary legally binding commitments for countries to attain particular goals. So again, also reminding us and the wider academic and policy world that the SDGs are rather, in our view, top level, again, voluntary, but at top level, it's more like a vision, right, for all countries. And we need stronger instruments, legally binding documents, commitments also under this overall vision of the SDGs. And an example is the current attempt to create a plastic or treaty, international treaty to prevent plastic pollution, which is in the making and has some potential, but also here we see strong influence of some countries that are not interested into a very far-reaching international treaty, and also private sector is quite involved into weakening such a treaty draft. But nevertheless, we have this ambition to, or we have this current effort to form an internationally binding treaty on plastic pollution or preventing plastic pollution. And this is, from a distant view, still a promising initiative. I think we need more of these legally binding complementary treaties. Lastly, also coming to an end of this whole input institutionalization, we also see that we need stronger anchoring of the global goals in the United Nations system. So governance need to build stronger institutions in line with the SDGs at global and national level to make the SDGs a fundamental part of decision-making processes, which again comes close to the earlier point about accountability ecosystems that are emerging. And we still need to strengthen such channels and tools for holding public authorities accountable for achieving and implementing the SDGs. So very finally, then we had one additional attempt to argue that together with Magdalena Bexell, that we also see some promise in combining the SDGs with the larger and more long-standing human rights regime, and we need stronger integration, especially here. So this is taking up the fourth point of the previous slide about the governance reforms, about institutionalization. We see that there's some potential to integrate the SDGs with human rights because there are these substantive overlaps, but still these two areas work separately in practice very much. So the policy vision of the SDGs and the long-standing human rights system, they operate in separate spheres, and they do not make, in our view, sufficient references to each other. And secondly, we argue that the SDGs could give visibility to essential human rights, which are inherent in many goals, and human rights could then also reinforce the SDGs through existing monitoring mechanisms. So there's this potential synergy between the SDGs and human rights. And in this way, again, the accountability of the SDGs could be enhanced. And with that, I come to an end of my input. Thanks very much for your attention.
Well, thanks very much, Thomas, for a great presentation. Certainly a good dose of pessimism and some optimism too, hopefully. Certainly at the halfway point of the SDGs, progress has been pretty slow, and it does seem that the goals will not be achieved by 2030. But as you say, you know, the goals themselves and the central claim in the SDGs and the 2030 agenda for transforming our world are extremely ambitious, and I don't know if there was really any expectation that we'd achieve the goals by 2030 anyway, and perhaps, you know, some of the green shoots that we're seeing with different actors working with the goals could lead to greater changes over time, particularly over the long term, if we extend that time frame out beyond 2030. So certainly a lot to think about, and I have lots of questions, but I'll open it to the floor. If anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, or yeah, you can also put something in the chat. I'll have a look. Shirin, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. I actually have a couple of questions, but maybe I'll start with one, and if there is time, I can ask the second question later. So I was wondering about the challenge that you mentioned around the lack of political will for achieving the SDGs or effectively implementing the SDGs, which is definitely something that we are observing also across the world in our work. And this is something that sometimes I ask myself, because at least in democratic settings, you often say that if you want to move governments and policymakers, you really need to move constituencies and get these issues in public domain, and really also enhancing that discursive effect that you have found. And this has happened definitely in some parts of the world. In Australia, not really a lot. I mean, the SDGs are not really in the public debate. Some organizations and institutions are working with them, using them. Cities, local governments, and some businesses in the first few years after the SDGs were adopted really engage with them, but they're not really having presence in the public sphere, really. Whereas I would say that somewhere like, for example, Sweden, where you are in, you gave an example of giving a talk about the SDGs at your son's school. So they are very much in the public domain, but still we're not seeing that kind of engagement and really strong push. Why do you think that is? And what does it come down to? Is it really because it is just a very big framework with so many complex issues in play that really disincentivizes the focus on a particular topic, and then rallying all resources and mobilizing all resources around that topic? Is it the reason, or what are your observations, really?
Thanks very much. Are we collecting, or can I respond directly? I think it makes sense, right?
Yeah, I think please go ahead, Thomas, and then I'll move on to the next.
Thanks, Shirin. I think a very good question. I don't have a very good answer, I think, but I can try to share my experiences also again with Sweden, and maybe here I would still see the glass is half full, because we observe these discursive effects, right? We saw that it's quite, in some countries, in the public debate, and maybe that's a precondition, right, for the next more stronger, more challenging, more ambitious steps to be taken, also to introduce effective political programs and also effective budget increases for sustainable development. And yeah, you're saying political will is crucial, and maybe in order to get there, coming back to my point about accountability systems, we perhaps have to use this debate, this discourse, and the language and the communication about the SDGs, and try to put our hopes on civil society and the general population, right? That is obviously then informed in Sweden and some other countries in the world, and this gives a good is a good precondition, right, to push governments further. Even though, of course, in Sweden we have a bit of a backlash, but it's also again leading to a constructive debate between the current government and civil society organizations. So in that view, I might be a bit more optimistic here that perhaps political will can be generated and also translated into political action if the precondition and the debate is pushed further by civil society organizations. But overall, I don't have a good answer why, nevertheless, we don't see yet strong action. Maybe we have to accept that it takes more time than expected. And nevertheless, also these smaller steps are steps in the right direction.
So I have Tal and then Rob.
Thank you very much, Cam, and thanks so much, Thomas. And this is, I feel so important to understand what can make the SDGs more effective. And as someone who's been, I guess, interested in the SDGs really since before they were even completely formulated, I wanted to pick up on something Cam said around the expectation of what they would have achieved by now. Given there were really quite a completely new, different kind of agenda to anything that was done before, except the MDGs, which were a very specific kind of approach. I think in 7 years, it's a really quite a remarkable uptake that they've had. And so I guess my question to you is, what did you expect would happen within 7 years of something like the SDGs coming into force? And were you really, given your understanding of how global governance and governments work, expecting something different? The other part of it is, if we didn't have the SDGs, what do you think what would the world have looked like? How much of what is happening now would have happened anyway? And I'm really quite curious about that because I feel like we needed something to hang on to, and that's what the SDGs provided. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it at these two questions.
Yeah, very good points. Try again my best answer, even though it's called big questions. What can make the SDGs more effective is indeed a crucial question, right? And my expectation, maybe I was naive, right? When I started my research on the political impact of the SDGs together with colleagues, hopes were high, expectations also perhaps maybe too high, but also simply because it was a bit unprecedented. You mentioned the MDGs, but governance by goal setting was not very much used by the United Nations. So it was a new attempt, I would say, even though it was, of course, building upon earlier initiatives by the United Nations, but at this scale, it was quite new, novel. And some scholars, and I was not in this process, but they also looked and hoped that the SDGs have a bit of an orchestration function. So they would lead to a nice orchestra that is then everybody is playing the different instruments. And this is guided by the SDGs. SDGs as the conductor. But that was a bit, I would say, also naive, because what we see instead is that the SDGs are more like the lyrics or the notes, the text, and this is interpreted quite differently by different actors. So the SDGs are not themselves the orchestrator, the conductor, but it's actually needed that we need many different conductors, and we have to also, as scientists, I guess, play a certain function to observe whether the SDGs are interpreted and implemented in an appropriate way in different areas of the world. So now a bit going away from your question, but maybe my expectations, to be honest, 7-8 years ago, were a bit too high, and maybe I'm not more realistic about what the voluntary framework of the SDGs can achieve, and still also not neglecting and recognizing the positive impact about changing our debates, discurses, because that's, again, I think in my view also a good foundation for stronger action to be taken. And then your second point was about causality. So how would the world look like without the SDGs? Quite similar or really different? That's a crucial question I cannot really answer, right? Because it's quite hypothetical endeavor, and I don't think would look much differently, but I think it's a positive development that we have this universal vision, right? And the question is again, what we make out of the vision, and this depends on actions of all parts of society, including scientists, but also public authorities, but also civil society, and also the private companies. So in a positive world, you would see some division of labor, and they all do their parts in order to achieve sustainable development. We know that that's not the case, but it's at least the universal vision that can guide us, and is also a good benchmark to see whether we are on track to achieve sustainable development or not. So in that sense, I see it positive.
So we've got about 2 minutes left. Rob, I'll let you do a very quick last question, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up.
Thanks, Cameron. I'll try and be brief, but it's kind of a big question, to be honest. And but thanks, Thomas. Great presentation, very comprehensive. Really enjoyed it. My question was triggered by something that you started with, that at the moment it would be very difficult to get the SDGs established given the current global political climate. And it made me think that in many ways the current global governance mechanisms that we have are a direct result of right-wing extremism and 2 world wars in the previous century, right? The UN was established to maintain global peace. And so that made me think, well, do we actually conceptually have a good understanding of those relationships between wars and extremism and political trends and global governance mechanisms? And this is not to say that let's wait to have another war and then everything will be good again. But do we actually have a good understanding of the role of wars? We usually tend to sort of point to them as external events that influence our ability to achieve the SDGs. But can we go deeper than that, conceptually speaking?
Very good point. Sounds more like a research proposal idea, right? We have to, I agree.
That's right.
Dive deeper into this topic, so we could consider discussing it in more detail. I don't have a good comment on that, but simply that indeed, unfortunately, we have to study this relationship given existing power struggles that might even intensify in the next couple of years. So looking forward to get deeper into this discussion. And yeah, it's a pity that we have to go this way, but I think it's important.
Thanks.
Okay, so it's 5 o'clock, so I'll wrap it up. Thanks again, Thomas, for a really great presentation, and for giving up your time to speak with us. I hope everyone really enjoyed it. I certainly did, and benefited a lot from it. And yeah, it'd be good to stay in touch and see how we can continue to work together.
Thanks. It was a pleasure. Here it's 9 o'clock, so I'm starting into the day. But I wish you a good evening, wherever you're based. All the best. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you. Good to see you. Bye-bye.